Good morning, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word. Hey, thanks for joining me this morning. We're going to be talking about a very special person, not necessarily worship leader, but a singer in our past, and talk about one of the great hymns of the faith, How Great Thou Art. Join me. We'll be getting eventually to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but I tell you what, it's a frosty morning where we are. Talk about super cold. Everything you touch just feels cold. I don't know about where you are, but some folks are buried in a foot or more of snow this morning. So it's a frosty time, a good time to think about some singing to warm things up. Well, listen, when we went to South Georgia to start the Perimeter Road Baptist Church, one of the key members of the core group that came out of First Baptist was a man named Frank Christian. And Frank and Carolyn were part of that original group that helped us start Perimeter. And Frank had a very special gift. I mean, he was a building contractor. There are all kinds of things he did. He was a businessman, but he could sing. And his reputation was as the George Beverly Shea of South Georgia. And if you listen to his tremendous deep voice, it would be at times very hard for you to distinguish between George Beverly Shea and Frank Christian. His voice quite often was used to sing special music in our church. And when folks would pass away, he was one of the favorite singers at funerals. Tony Carroll would take Frank with him quite often and around to sing at revival meetings and would have to play for him at funerals, things of that nature. Frank just had a great reputation for being able to sing the great gospel songs. And of course, one of the favorites was How Great Thou Art. Now, where did this song come from? We almost take it for granted these days, but there was a time early on that it was looked upon as one of those new songs that popped up, and we just don't include that in our hymns in our churches. No, we don't sing that kind of stuff around here. Well, when it was originally brought to the attention of George Beverly Shea, it's a song that had bounced around since the late 1800s. There's a long story behind it. You can research that if you like. But it was originally written by a man from Sweden, a pastor who was also in the government there in Sweden. It bounced around in many different languages and primarily been written in Russian. In 1954, George Beverly Shea was handed a pamphlet that highlighted this particular song. And as he received a bunch of suggestions for hymns to sing, he didn't think that much of it, but as he began to read it, all of a sudden things began to come together. It was amazing that as this hymn had been bouncing around, it finally was brought to the attention of an English missionary couple. That was Mr. and Mrs. Stuart Hine, and it was widely used by them in evangelism out in the western Ukraine. After singing it for many years in Russian, Mr. Hine translated 3 verses into English. And when the Second World War broke out, the Hines returned to Britain, where the 4th stanza was added in 1948. The completed song was printed in 1949 in a Russian gospel magazine published by Mr. Hine. The reprints were requested by missionaries all over the world. It was one of those leaflets that was given to George Beverly Shea in 1954. He said, we first sang the song, How Great Thou Art, in the Toronto, Canada Crusade of 1955. Cliff Barrows and his large volunteer choir assisted in the majestic refrain, and soon after that we used it on the Hour of Decision and in American Crusades. In the New York meetings of 1957, the choir joined me in singing it 99 times. It became a keynote of praise each evening. Well, reading the first verses of the song of worship, we think of the opening words of Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Karl Boberg, that's the Swedish pastor that wrote it, once said that the inspiration for his original hymn was the beauty of the Swedish meadows and lakes after a summer thunderstorm. Now, before I read some of the rest of the story about it, let's read the verses and once again listen to the majesty of this song, How Great Thou Art. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder. thy power throughout the universe displayed. Well, when through the woods and forest glades I wander, and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees, when I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, and hear the brook, and feel the gentle breeze, and when I think that God his Son not sparing sent him to die, I scarce can take it in, that on that cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. When Christ shall come with shout of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart! Then I shall bow in humble adoration and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Now, before we go to the refrain, let's go back for some of the story as George Beverly Shea writes about it in the great book about crusade hymns. It was published by the Billy Graham Association. Stuart Hine also had written that first verse of the English version also came to life after a memorable thunderstorm in a Carpathian mountain village in Czechoslovakia, where he had to seek shelter for the night. On a later occasion, he visited the mountain country in Romania, and in the grandeur of those woods and forest glades, he heard a group of young Christians burst instinctively into song, accompanied by their mandolins and guitars. The hymn that they were singing was How Great Thou Art. In Russian, of course. Yes, God does talk to us through his creation, Hines speaks. He said, the heavens and the earth declare his glory, but the greatness of God is shown even more completely in the salvation he has planned and provided for us. What wisdom it reveals, what love it discloses. As the third stanza confesses, the greatness is more than I can understand. I scarce can take it in. Now, Mr. Hine also says that this final verse was written just after the Second World War, when many refugees from Eastern Europe were streaming into England. And although they had found greater safety and freedom in their adopted land, their incessant question was, when are we going home? Well, it's only when we reach our heavenly home that we will fully comprehend the greatness of our God. And as the Apostle Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 13:2, now we only, as it said in the King James, see through a glass darkly. Now, what does that mean? In the New English Bible, as George Beverly Shea quoted it, it was like, now we only see a puzzling reflection in a mirror. Now, that particular verse is quite interesting because, again, see through a glass darkly, what does that mean? Some of the newer translations will say we just see in a mirror. But when you and I look in a mirror, it's a very clear picture, isn't it? Because modern mirrors can be made with absolute perfection. In the Apostle Paul's day, that's not what a mirror would have looked like. There would have been quite a few imperfections, and the appearance that you saw was not clear, and it wouldn't be the actual person in their completeness. That's why the King James said, see through a glass darkly. Now, in the Christian Standard Bible, it says we see only a reflection in a mirror. But what kind of reflection? As the CJB says, we see obscurely in a mirror. The ESV would say, see dimly in a mirror. In other words, it's not an accurate reflection of what we are seen as or what God is. We will see one day, though, completely when we see him face to face. That's when it will all come together. And that's when we come to the final wonderful refrain of this song. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. George Beverly Shea closes by saying, in that day we shall bow in humble adoration and say, my God, how great thou art. Beautiful hymn story, and from which have sprung many others. How great is our God. So many songs written about the greatness of God, all coming from the scriptures that point us to that day when we'll know it all for certain. Well, God bless you. You have a great day in him. We'll see you next time right here as we wake up in his word.